Okay, imagine this, a concrete wall, almost 100 years old, stuck deep in the Black Canyon of the Mojave Desert. It's holding back something it was never really built to handle in this century. I mean, 40 million Americans rely on the water it controls, the power it makes, the whole stability it represents, but almost none of them have ever heard the phrase spillway erosion vulnerability. Crazy, right? Right now, there's just this colossal amount of water, we're talking cubic miles, not just gallons, pressing against that wall, pushing it higher than it's been in a generation. You can feel the pressure building. Seismometers inside the dam's foundations, the ones designed to pick up tiny tremors, are now recording this constant low hum. It's the sound of a river rediscovering a power we all thought was gone. 30 miles away, the hotels in Las Vegas sparkle in the desert night, totally dependent on this silent, massive strain happening upstream. But here's the kicker, the detail that really tells the story. For 20 years, the talk was all about things dying. The Colorado River was drying up. Lake Mead was shrinking. The problem was always about not having enough water. Then, last fall and winter, 2024 if we're being specific, the weather just totally flipped. These huge atmospheric rivers, which usually stay on the Pacific coast, started tracking inland. They just dumped massive amounts of moisture into the upper Colorado Basin. The ground, which had been bone dry for a generation, couldn't soak it all up. The snowpack in the Rockies, already bigger than average, got drenched and then just became liquid. The drought didn't end. It was violently replaced by a flood. And nobody really told you about how fast this all happened. Back in August of 2022, Lake Mead hit its lowest point ever, just 1,040 feet above sea level. That's barely 27% of its capacity. The Bureau of Reclamation was putting out these scary reports, predicting exactly when a lake would hit dead pool, which is when water can't even flow downstream anymore. The intake pipes for Las Vegas, built way down deep, were suddenly exposed to air for the first time. The media narrative was set, a slow, predictable, inevitable death. Then, by July 2023, we started seeing the first hint that things were changing. A strong winter lifted the lake by 20 feet. Everyone, especially officials, cheered it as a win for conservation, a temporary relief, but it turned out to be a bit of a false signal. The underlying problem, the massive deficit, was still there. Fast forward to November 2024. The first atmospheric river made landfall in California, but instead of breaking apart, it actually held its shape. It rode the jet stream right over the Sierra Nevada mountains like a highway, and just started hammering Utah and Colorado with historic rainfall. Hydrologists noticed, like, whoa, this is weird. By January 2025, a second, even stronger atmospheric river followed the exact same path. Then a third, and a fourth. The ground in the upper basin went from super dry to completely soaked. The flow into the Green River, the San Juan, the Gunnison, all the rivers that feed the Colorado went from a trickle to a roaring flood. Small towns in western Colorado saw flooding they hadn't experienced in 50 years. All that water was moving downstream. By March 2025, the water pouring into Lake Powell, which is upstream from Lake Mead, was over 200,000 cubic feet per second for 12 days straight. The people running the Glen Canyon Dam, facing their own catastrophic overflow situation, had to make a tough call. They opened the release gates wider than they had been since the floods of 1983. A torrent of water, controlled but still monumental, started its journey south, right through the Grand Canyon, heading for Lake Mead. And by April 2025, that wave hit Lake Mead's usually calm, almost stagnant water. The lake's surface, which had been creeping up by inches a week, was now rising by feet every single day. That old bleached bathtub ring on the canyon walls, that stark 170-foot marker of 20 years of loss, started to disappear. First the lower part, then the middle. Water flowed back into coves and marinas that had been dry land for like forever. Boats that were stuck in the mud floated again. But honestly, this wasn't really a recovery. It felt more like an invasion. As of today, the lake has come up over 125 feet in less than 6 months. A recovery that experts said would take decades of good rainfall happened in one season. The whole system just got slammed from one extreme to the other. And Hoover Dam, this amazing example of 20th century engineering, is completely unprepared for this specific 21st century problem. We're talking weather whiplash. Now, let's zoom in a bit. Forget the big weather patterns for a second and just look at the Mojave Desert. See the dam for what it truly is, a curved wedge of concrete, 700 feet thick. It's not just one solid block. It's a bunch of interlocking vertical sections poured between 1931 and 1935. It actually used enough concrete to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York City. The heat it gave off while curing was so intense that engineers had to run over 582 miles of steel pipes inside it, pumping ice-cold river water through to stop it from cracking apart under its own heat. That process should have taken 125 years, but they did it in 2. It was truly a triumph of planning and brute force. Look at the area it controls. Upstream, when it's full, Lake Mead stretches for 112 miles, a huge, complicated reservoir. Downstream, the river flows south past casino towns like Laughlin, Nevada, and its sister city, Bullhead City, Arizona, past Needles, California. Then it gets caught again by Hoover Dam, creating Lake Havasu, which is where the Colorado River Aqueduct gets its water. That aqueduct supplies a huge chunk of water to 20 million people in Southern California. Even further south, the Imperial Dam diverts almost all the remaining water into the All-American Canal, which waters the massive farms of the Imperial Valley, where most of America's winter veggies come from. The whole thing is one big connected system. And Hoover Dam? It's basically the heart valve. For 20 years, that valve was all about managing scarcity. Now it has to handle a terrifying abundance. And here's the thing you won't find in many headlines, the detail buried in the blueprints that everyone ignored during those long drought years. The dam has 2 main ways to let water out. First, through the penstocks, those giant 13-foot diameter pipes that feed the turbines to make electricity. But those can only handle so much. The second way is the spillways. There are 2 of them, one on the Arizona side, one on the Nevada side, set high up on the canyon walls, about 40 feet below the dam's top. These aren't fancy, modern gates. They're basically concrete troughs like supersized bathtubs that lead into 50-foot diameter tunnels drilled through the canyon walls. If the lake level gets too high, water just spills over the edge of these troughs and plunges down the tunnels, rejoining a river way downstream. They're a last resort safety feature. They've only been used twice in the dam's entire history, once for testing in 1941 and then during the big floods of 1983. They haven't been used in over 40 years, and that's why we have a problem. Dr. Michael Fenton, a civil engineer who really knows his stuff about dam safety, actually said the spillways at Hoover were an engineering marvel for the 1930s. They are not what we would build today. The big worry is something called cavitation. When water moves super fast over a surface, even tiny flaws can cause the pressure to drop so low that little vapor bubbles form. When those bubbles pop, they create these micro jets of water strong enough to cause tiny explosions. One bubble? No big deal. But billions of them, over hours or days, can act like a sandblaster, absolutely tearing apart concrete and even solid rock. In 2017, this exact thing happened and ripped a hole the size of a football field in the main spillway of the Oroville Dam in California, forcing 188,000 people to evacuate. The spillway at Oroville had been used off and on, but the ones at Hoover have just sat there, baking in the desert sun, exposed to all those temperature changes, for 4 decades. The concrete is old, the tunnels are cut into the canyon's volcanic rock. If something goes wrong there, it won't be some slow, gradual erosion. It'll be an explosive, totally catastrophic failure of the emergency release system. The water is still coming up. It's now within 15 feet of the spillway crests. The Bureau of Reclamation is letting out as much water as possible through the turbines, but the water coming in from Lake Powell just keeps on coming. The choice is getting pretty clear. Either let the lake overflow the spillways and just hope they hold, or risk the lake rising over the top of the dam itself, which would be an unimaginable disaster for the whole continent. But that's honestly only half the issue. The real, more likely danger isn't some dramatic Hollywood-style dam break. The spillway failure is the absolute worst case. What's far more probable is that the operators will actually be forced to use them. And they'll work. They'll do exactly what they're designed to do. Water will pour into those concrete troughs and roar down the half-mile tunnels at over 150 miles per hour. The sound would be a continuous thunder heard for miles, and a massive amount of water, close to 400,000 cubic feet per second, would be unleashed into the narrow canyon below the dam. That's the secondary threat, a planned controlled release that would still be an unprecedented flood for everyone downstream. The normal flow of the Colorado below Hoover Dam lately has been more like 10,000 to 15,000 cubic feet per second. Towns like Laughlin and Bullhead City are built right up to the river's edge, banking on this calm, predictable river. Their casinos, their homes, their golf courses. A release of 400,000 cubic feet per second wouldn't just raise the river, it would create a brand new river. It would be a wall of water moving south. Picture this. A blackjack dealer in Laughlin finishes their late shift. They walk out into the cool desert air and hear this low, unfamiliar rumble from the north. The ground feels like it's vibrating. An alert pops up on their phone about an emergency release at the dam. It doesn't quite sink in. The river has been this calm green ribbon their whole life. By the time they get to their car in the employee parking lot, the water is already gushing over the fancy riverfront promenade, swallowing park benches and palm trees. The main bridge connecting Nevada and Arizona, the one they cross every day, isn't built for this kind of flow. Police cars with flashing lights are blocking it off. There's no way across. The river is rising by feet every minute, and the whole city is being cut in half. Their home in Bullhead City is on the other side, and it's probably already underwater. The domino effect of failures would just keep escalating from there. First, the downstream towns. Laughlin and Bullhead City would be completely swamped within hours. Just Bullhead City alone has 39,000 residents. Their power, their water treatment plants, their emergency services, all of it would be ruined. The flood wave would keep moving south. Next, the infrastructure. That Highway 95 bridge, the main road, the bridges near Needles, all the low-lying power lines and substations. Everything was built based on what the 1983 flood could handle as the absolute most. But 1983 was before 2 decades of intense building right along the riverbanks. The economic damage would be in the billions. Then, there are the next dams in the chain. Parker Dam, a smaller, thinner structure, would get hit with water it was never designed to deal with. Its operators would be in an impossible spot. Either hold back the water and risk the dam itself breaking, or let the flood go downstream, making it even worse for the farmlands of the Imperial Valley. The aqueduct intakes at Lake Havasu could get damaged by the sheer force and amount of water, which would threaten the water supply for Los Angeles and San Diego. And don't forget the power grid. Hoover Dam provides electricity for millions in Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. While a high lake level actually means more potential power right now, a full-blown emergency release could force a complex shutdown. The turbines might not even work with all those turbulent conditions from a spillway release. Plus, all the transmission lines downstream are vulnerable. Las Vegas, the city of lights, could totally go dark. Finally, there's the entire southwestern economy. Agriculture in the Imperial and Coachella Valleys depends completely on water delivered at very specific times from the All-American Canal. A flood like this would mess up the whole system, possibly destroying the canal intakes at Imperial Dam. That wouldn't just mean flooded fields, it would mean a major disruption to the food supply chain for the whole country. Here's something else that isn't getting much attention. The problem isn't just the water, it's the sediment. For 90 years, Lake Mead has basically been a giant trap for sediment. The Colorado River, whose name actually means red-colored, naturally carries a massive amount of silt and clay. Nearly a century's worth of it has settled at the bottom of the lake, especially near the dam. As the lake level dropped during the drought, this sediment got super compacted and solid. Now, with the lake rising historically fast and this immense pressure, the stability of that sediment delta is a huge unknown. A landslide of that material under the water near the penstock intakes could clog them up, cutting off power generation instantly. If it broke loose near the spillway intakes, it could send a slurry of rock and mud into the tunnels, making the water's erosive power even stronger. It's nearly impossible to predict what would happen. We built this whole system for a climate that just doesn't exist anymore. Dr. Lena Petrova, a climate scientist I know from her recent paper, put it really clearly. We've entered an era of hydroclimatic volatility. The past doesn't really tell us anything about the future anymore. Systems designed for scarcity are completely unprepared to deal with these sudden violent shifts to abundance. Basically, the dam was built to tame a wild river, but we just assumed the river would play by the same rules. Those rules have changed. The river is wild in a completely new way now. And here's another thing nobody typically brings up about the dam itself. The concrete in Hoover Dam is technically still curing. It won't reach its full design strength for another few hundred years. But it's also been under stresses the original engineers could never have imagined. The alkali-silica reaction, this slow, sort of cancerous swelling in the concrete, was only discovered decades after the dam was built. They've been monitoring it for years, saying it's stable. But that stability was based on conditions where the reservoir was slowly getting smaller. Now, the dam is being squeezed again by a weight it hasn't felt in over 20 years. This enormous structure is actually breathing. It's bending on a super tiny level. And inside the inspection galleries, those long, cathedral-like tunnels inside the dam, sensors are picking up data points that we've never seen before. The operators at the Bureau of Reclamation are some of the best in the world. They're dealing with an impossible situation, but they're kind of flying blind. The guides they have for a scenario like this are all based on the 1983 flood. But in 1983, the lake didn't rise this fast. In 1983, the communities downstream were way smaller. In 1983, the dam was 40 years younger. What happens next? That's the part no one can answer. Maybe the atmospheric river pattern breaks and the water coming in drops as quickly as it started, leaving the system stressed but okay. Maybe the operators figure out how to balance the releases, avoiding the spillways and preventing a flood downstream, but that would mean the weather has to cooperate perfectly. Or another storm could come inland. The snowpack in the Rockies has a record amount of water locked in it, like a ticking bomb just waiting for a warm spell. A fast melt in May could send a second, even bigger surge of water down the canyon. So many questions come up. How good is that 40-year-old spillway concrete after decades of baking in the desert sun? How will all that compacted sediment at the bottom of the reservoir react to the sudden massive repressurization? Can you even evacuate hundreds of thousands of people from a floodplain when the danger isn't a hurricane with days of warning, but a dam gate opening with only hours? And is the bigger failure the dam's engineering itself, or just our failure of imagination that let us build whole cities right on the banks of a river we thought we'd tamed completely? This system was made to prevent floods and manage droughts. It was never designed to handle both right after each other. The thing threatening Las Vegas and the whole American Southwest isn't a lack of water anymore. It's a concrete wall from the Great Depression sitting over a river that is violently woken up. And right now, on a buoy in the middle of Lake Mead, a solar-powered sensor pings a satellite every 15 minutes. Its GPS data shows its elevation is still going up, the water is still rising, the pressure is still building, and high up on the canyon walls, the concrete lips of the spillways sit silent, dry, and just waiting.